Okay, once you verified that, then you need to start looking at what kind of system you're going to be installing. Are you going to deal with MBR, your master boot record, or GPT? GPT, it can either be known as a GUID partition table or a global partition table. Okay, basically, Windows will use one of these two methods to lay out their hard drive. And what both of these do is they're basically like a table of contents for your computer when it boots up. They will tell you where the partition is located that has the Windows installation, what other partitions are available on the drive, all that kind of stuff. Okay, the main difference between the MBR and the GPT is that MBR is like a legacy system. If your system is, if your computer is running 32-bit, if it's running less than 2 terabytes of your hard drive space, then you can get away with a MBR. If you're running 64-bit or over 2 terabytes on your hard drive space, you need that GPT. Okay, no matter what, Windows is always going to use NTFS as their file system. That's the new technology file system is the way they label it as. Okay, so Windows always operates off of that. Okay. We've already talked about the fact that Windows uses the C drive as the local disk. Okay, it generally is going to install all of the Windows components within that C:\Windows folder that you can see right here. Okay, so that's how Windows is going to be laid out on the drive itself. Okay, so in addition to looking at the MBR and the GPT, you also have to decide whether or not your system is going to run a standard BIOS system or a UEFI system. And again, the difference here is basically just going to be how your system is laid out, what it's using. Okay, is it using 32-bit, 64-bit, over 2 terabytes, under 2 terabytes? Same type of thing applies. The BIOS, or basic input output system, is going to be for your older legacy systems. UEFI is going to be for your newer system. Okay, this is all handled when you first turn on the computer. This is when you first turn on the computer, your UEFI or BIOS is going to manage all the hardware straight out of the box, or straight as it starts up. Okay, it's going to basically tell the computer basic communications are set forth, stuff like that. Okay, so it allows for the testing of the hardware and everything like that to be taken care of. And speaking of which, both the UEFI and the BIOS have 3 different types of functions. Okay, first you have the system. Okay, this is basically going to tell the computer how to communicate with the OS. Okay, basically it's going to tell your operating system, you have this type of motherboard, you have this type of processor, you have this type of hard drive, and the OS will then know how to communicate with them. Then you also have the startup UEFI or BIOS. This is basically going to tell the computer where the boot device is, how to actually go about the whole function of booting up your system. Okay, so if we look at that real quick, essentially when you look at the boot up process, it's going to happen pretty basically. What's going to happen is, first your BIOS is going to start up and it's going to load a post test, a power on self test. It's going to do very superficial communications with the devices on your system, and it's going to determine whether or not everything is communicating properly. Okay, then you get into your standard BIOS here, where it's going to basically start the communication between the operating system and the hardware devices. From there, and again, this can be BIOS/UEFI, but from there, it's going to be passed on to the master boot record or the GPT. Okay, again, this is going to tell the computer where to look whenever your computer boots up to see, okay, this partition is going to be where Windows is located. This is the one I want to boot from. And then finally, over here, once it tells you, once the MBR GPT passes that on, it's going to get to the OS. The OS is then going to go from here and boot off into the desktop. Okay, so that's your basic booting up scenario. Okay, so hopefully that'll kind of help you out, help you visualize that. Okay, so that's your startup UEFI or BIOS. Then you got your setup UEFI or BIOS. This is where you can actually get in and make changes to the BIOS. You can enable or disable devices. You can change power settings. You can do all that kind of stuff. So this is where also where you can actually get in and change the settings for maybe like the speed of your processor, or making sure that your hard drive is being picked up efficiently and everything like that. So that's your setup UEFI or BIOS. Okay, so we kind of talked about the difference between the two. So this is basically just kind of going over that. You know, BIOS is going to be your legacy. UEFI is going to be your new overview, or your new BIOS of your newer computers. So the new UEFI is known as UEFI CSM. Okay, and again, it deals with 64-bit versions, anything over 2 terabytes, and it also comes with a system called Security Boot. The Secure Boot basically allows for locking down of the UEFI or the BIOS before anything can get in and make changes. Basically, essentially, trying to make sure that malware and other malicious software doesn't get into the UEFI and alter any settings or anything like that. Because if anything like that happens, then it's extremely hard to recover and get your computer working properly. Because from that point, they essentially can get into anything, including the operating system and everything like that. Okay, so this is the last slide of this part of this section of Chapter 8, but this is dealing with going through and making sure that you've got everything you need before you get that install, okay? Making sure that you've verified all the files you need are present. So that's where device drivers come in. Okay, device driver within Windows is essentially just a small program that's going to basically tell the operating system how to communicate with a device. So if you plug in a USB drive, it's going to tell Windows that this is a USB drive and you need to communicate it this way and share this communication path and everything like that. Okay, what we've already talked about is the fact that you need to make sure and remember that 32-bit operating system requires 32-bit drivers, 64-bit OS requires 64-bit drivers, and so on. Okay, device drivers themselves, if you buy a laptop or computer from the manufacturer, they should be installed. Okay, should be part of the OEM package. If you're installing an OS for the first time or upgrading or something like that, you may need new device drivers. So these can either be loaded from any type of media you may receive from the manufacturer, or the easiest thing to do is just download it off the website because that'll have the newest version. Okay, so just make sure that you have the right version of the driver whenever you're installing it. Okay, so if you're not sure if certain devices are going to work, then there's a couple different things you can do. This mentions making a dual boot, which is also referred to as multi-boot, and that's what we kind of talked about a little bit last chapter, where you set up 2 partitions or multiple partitions, and then one partition can run Windows 7, another one can run Windows 8, or another one can run Linux or something like that. Basically, you can go and turn one into a test machine to see what devices are going to work and which ones are not. Okay, so that's the end of this first part. We'll pick up with some special considerations in part 2 of Chapter 8.